Hello, good morning everybody. My name is Tamsin Rose, the Senior Fellow for Health at Friends of Europe think tank based in Brussels. Today we're going to be talking about investing in innovation in health, a new industrial strategy for the COVID-19 era. And of course, as 2020 draws to a close, the world has learnt some very cruel lessons about our shared vulnerability, our shared connectedness. But at the same time, there is tremendous hope. We have had unprecedented and extraordinary collaboration. We've shared data. We've invested together and developed new knowledge about a disease we knew nothing about 12 months ago. In that time, millions of people around the world have been infected, but we've also learnt to understand it. We've got treatments and vaccines emerging and being regulated and approved in the coming months. So there's hope at the end of this tumultuous year. But it has taught us some lessons. Europe already has a leading role in the global life sciences sector. We're also the continent in the world that has the most cost-effective and efficient delivery of healthcare systems in the world. So we have much that we could build on. But COVID-19 has taught us where there are gaps, the weaknesses and fragilities in our system. We have learned now that we need to invest in a different way, in a smart way when we look at rebuilding and restarting our economies to make sure that we have the resilience in our societies to cope with this and future threats. Because one thing is certain, there will be more health threats coming, and we will need to be ready to respond quicker and more efficiently and in a way that is more inclusive and saves lives and saves our system. So today we're going to be looking at that connection between industrial strategy and our health and well-being. For those of you who would like to participate, and we encourage that very strongly, you can do it in two ways. You can do it via Twitter using the hashtag FOEdebate. And for those of you who are watching on the Zoom platform, you can raise your virtual hand. And just in a few minutes, I will be inviting some kickoff speakers to give us their early thoughts, and then I'll be asking you to put your questions. So this is a debate about the future of our societies and the role of industry in helping to meet our shared goals. So your voices, your questions are just as important. So let me start now by introducing Christoph Grüdler, a member of the European Parliament who sits in the committee that deals with industry, research and energy. My question for you is, as the year comes to a close, there is hope on the horizon. There are vaccines that will be arriving and are starting to be rolled out across Europe. When we look forward to 2021 and the big plans to restart our economies and start going again, what do you think are the lessons that we should learn about the role of industry for Europe?
Thank you very much. Good morning, Friends of Europe. Thank you very much for organizing this event. I'm not an expert in health policies, but as a member of the E3 committee, I'm working directly on the challenge for the European industry. As you know, we recently adopted in the European Parliament a report on the future EU industrial strategy that the European Commission will update in March 2021. As shadow rapporteur for my group, Renew, for this text, I tried precisely to make sure that we took in account the lessons learned during this year. So what are the lessons, briefly, the lessons we learned? First, the crisis shows us how important it is to have a strong industry in Europe. During this crisis, one image particularly struck me. The planes arriving directly from China, full of masks, because we were not able to produce them in Europe. How is it possible to be so dependent on foreign industries for such a simple product? So the first lesson is that we cannot only have services and brain power in the EU, we also need a diversity a diversity of industries in Europe. The second lesson is that we must invest more into research and innovation. Fighting a crisis like this requires a lot of R&D. Research on the illness itself, research on testing, research on vaccine. Research allows us to get out this crisis. The EU already has the Horizon Europe program that integrates a specific cluster on health. This is a good start, especially as the last negotiations added 5 billion into this program. Moreover, I'm happy that for the first time in its history, the EU will have a specific program on health, which name is, as you know, EU for Health. Moreover, the recent announcement of the creation of an EU biomedical research agency, model on the US's BARDA, is also a very good signal. I hope the resources dedicated to this agency will be in line with our ambitions. And the third and last lesson could be that we need to support our SMEs in the industrial sector. Let's not forget that they represent 99% of European companies. During this crisis, we saw very innovative SMEs working hard to propose new solutions. However, most of the time, they face important barriers to enter the market and to reach the commercialization phase of their technologies. We have to help them to make sure that their innovations will benefit the whole society, especially in a time of crisis. A very important point here is also digitalization. The European industry, and in particular SMEs, are not enough digitalized. This is why our report on the European industrial strategy heavily insists on this point.
Thank you. So let me come back to a point you mentioned earlier, which was you talked about the planes coming and bringing to Europe the things that we couldn't make for ourselves, even the most basic things that we needed to protect our workers. And in the industrial strategy, we're starting to hear this concept of strategic autonomy. Can you give us a sense of what you think that would mean in practice in critical industries such as health?
I totally believe in strategic autonomy on the health. The COVID-19 crisis has shown how dependent the EU is in some strategic sector, and it's not possible. When our medical personnel was lacking personal protective equipment, our citizens didn't understand how it was possible to be so dependent on only one or two countries. So I defend the idea that in some key strategic sectors, the EU must have a strategic autonomy. In the defense sector, in the space sector, in the energy sector, and yes, in the health sector. First of all, it means diversifying our supplies. We must always have alternative to prevent us from being dependent from one actor. But then it also means relocating some industrial activities in the EU. We could start, for example, with the production of active substances. Today, there is 8 chances out of 10 that the component of our medicine comes from Asia. I think that the actors of the pharmaceutical industry have understood the importance of relocate. For example, the world leader and French company Accentis has, since the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis, significantly reinforced its production capacities in France. Moreover, safeguarding European production means producing according to European climate and social standards, and this is very important. But if we want to reach those goals and make it a reality, we will have to make European companies more competitive, and we will need to close the skill gaps and prevent a European brain drain. So to conclude, I'm very happy to see that the idea of European strategic autonomy is growing in the EU, and I will continue to push hard to make it happen. We need an effort on the European level and at the national level into the single market, of course. That will allow us to create new quality jobs and revitalize our territories. This is what our citizens are expecting from us.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And let me now turn to a national perspective. And I'm going to invite Romain Bonenfant, the head of the industry department for the French Ministry for Economy and Finances, to come in, because France is planning Le Grand Relance, where it's a new program of major public investment. And there you're trying to balance our economic competitiveness, the carbon transition, where we're trying to decarbonize our economies, and social cohesion. And many other European countries are also preparing their own big economic restart programs. What do you think Europe's approach to industrial policy offers to the ambitions of national governments?
Thank you, Tamsin. Hello, everyone. Thanks for inviting me to this debate, which is highly topical. As just Mr. Grudler said, in fact, during the economic crisis, during the COVID crisis, we witnessed major disruptions in basic supplies, especially in health, in basic medicines, in basic supplies for hospitals, and this calls for rethinking our economic policy. And you mentioned the France Relance, so our recovery program, and we can see that there is a big shift in the importance of industry in this recovery program, in our economic policy in general. To give a concrete example, through this program, which is basically 100 billion euro, 1/3 of it is going to industry. So it's huge. If we compare to the share, for example, of industry in our GDP, which is 12%, it's much higher, but it's warranted by what we have witnessed during this crisis. So in concrete terms, what we are doing is shifting our economic policy to industry and to a strategic approach in industry. So, for example, in this recovery plan, we have a whole program to secure strategic supplies. And for this, we have selected 5 strategic sectors in which we are incentivizing the creation of production capacities in the EU and especially in France. So these 5 sectors are electronics, 5G, basic supplies for industry like chemicals, food, and also, of course, health. So, for example, in health, what we are doing through our recovery program is to incentivize the localization of production capacity, both for mature products, but also for innovative products, so that we can have a system which is much more resilient. And in our recovery program, we also address major transformation of our industry, digitalization, decarbonation of industry. So again, some actions which are highly strategic to move our industry from a state where it is now to something which is much more resilient. So what do we expect from Europe for our program and in this shift in economic policy? I think it's basically scale. For major directions like this, we need to put our thinking at European level to leverage our internal market. So, for example, we welcome the announcement for a HERA agency, so the Health Emergency Response Authority, because it's a relevant scale to address the problem of crisis preparation on one hand, but also on addressing market failures for innovation. We also promote the launching of an important project of common European interest in health, because there again, it's through scale at European level where we will manage to actually have a concrete action to stimulate innovation in our health sector so that we can be more resilient to future crises.
Thank you very much. I mean, I noted that, the focus on, creating SMEs and the sort of bubbling up of the ideas that can then link into something bigger. And I'm particularly interested in thinking, I can see that at European level we can deliver scale, and that makes sense. But I mean, how do we balance out the importance of collaboration? And if we're having at EU level investment through the HERO program or other EU programs in early stage discovery and research, how do we deal with the competitiveness? Because each country wants to support their own industry. So what's the balance, the trade-off that you, from a national perspective, wants to see with Europe supporting industry as Europe in a global perspective, but amongst the countries, there was also a certain amount of competition. So what's the trade-off for you between collaboration and scale at European level, and then competitiveness and ambition at national level?
Yes, I think it's a very relevant question, because actually when we talk about resilience, it's sometimes seen as a way to actually do protectionist measures, to state the word we don't want to pronounce, but actually it's not how we see it and how we design our measures, because we believe we will achieve resilience through basically innovation and competitive business. And to have this innovation and competitiveness in our industry, that where we need to act at European level and what we need scale. So for example, we believe that to encourage the scale-up of SMEs and of innovative businesses and startups, for example, in health, we need to act at European level with a fund to facilitate the scale-up of these businesses. We need also to stimulate digital health, for example, share data at European level, and that we cannot achieve nationally. So I would not oppose this idea of resilience and the fact to act at European level, and I don't see it as a competition between countries, actually. I think we need to act collectively, and also I think a different way to see the question is to address the whole, I would say, value chain of investment, because in the recent years, we have put a lot of emphasis on the upstream, actually, on R&D, innovation, and it's of course relevant, but we need also to look at the investment in basically industrial facilities. That's what we are doing with our recovery program. And for that, I think the temporary regimes we have for state aid is highly relevant, highly useful, because it allows us to be much more efficient in this direction of the last mile to actually make the investment and to make the industrial capacity possible. And when we see it as a competition with other countries outside the EU, we understand that that's very relevant. And actually, in the concrete example we have of project refinance, we see things that happen on European soil that would have happened otherwise outside the EU without the aid on this industrial link. So I think state aid is key to this issue, and also public procurement, because I think the risk of disruption in industrial value chains are not factored in properly in our public procurement. That's what we saw in the disruption again in medicines, in supplies for hospitals. So there again, we need to rethink how we tailor our public procurement. And I think all this can be achieved through a policy, an industrial policy, which is really European, by an emphasis on innovation, on R&D, for which we need the European scale, but also where we have the last mile to actually make the industrial capacity possible in the EU.
Excellent, thank you very much. And now I'd like to introduce the next person who's going to join us, and we're going to introduce Despina Spanu, who is the head of cabinet for the Commissioner Margarita Chinas, who's responsible for the European way of life. Welcome, Despina. And I have a couple of questions for you. Obviously, this idea of the European way of life, health is very central to that, because of course we are the continent in the world that has set up universal health coverage as a key right. Let me ask you, COVID-19 has ensured that health is going to be a core focus of this Commission mandate. Probably not what people thought a year ago, but clearly now it's the focus. How do we make strategic investments in industry broadly that would help transform and upgrade our health capacity in Europe?
Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you for this very interesting discussion. I think you may be right that at the beginning of the mandate, we didn't know that health would take the dimension it did, but I think that Vice President von der Leyen always had the intention to give health a particular focus, not least because of her own background as a medical doctor, but also because she had already announced flagship initiatives, including the European plan on beating cancer and a new pharmaceutical strategy. So I think in a way we were preparing for a more thorough approach in European health and for an approach that would build what we call today, and we dare to say that, the European Health Union. I think that indeed the pandemic put health even more at the forefront and the priorities of the European way of life. And I think it showed that we need a European approach. Now, I think that strategic investments will become even more relevant than before. You are very right about that. And the way we have been managing the pandemic is such that will allow those that have to invest to do it by prioritizing where this is necessary. Whenever investment is called, the most intelligent thing to do is to target it. You cannot invest across the board. So right now, I think where we see a very important investment is to have this European health union. So I think going more for a European approach rather than the national approach. We saw during the pandemic how relevant the internal market, how relevant the internal market is for managing crisis. Problems at the borders, problems of production in one member state affecting another, all that was the first set of problems that we had to tackle in order to have the supplies available that we needed, etc. So I think the very first investment we have to do is a true internal market of medical supplies, medical staff, anything that has to do with providing healthcare. We need to also invest more in cross-border healthcare services and ensure that the internal market works in favor for health, have a mobility of services around health that allow you to manage not only standalone ad hoc situations like the pandemic, but more generally, creating a Europe where we have hubs of excellence for expertise, for certain diseases, for certain types of medical situations, etc. We also need to invest more in our pharmaceutical industry. Europe has always been very strong. The new pharmaceutical strategy for Europe that we adopted just 2 weeks ago, that has a very patient-centered strategy, also reaches out to the industry, explaining where we think investments need to be made and where focus needs to be given, and building a little bit more the European position, meaning that, okay, we talk a lot about this strategic autonomy, and a lot of people criticize this term as being a little bit protectionist. It is not about that. I think every part of the world wishes to be able to manage a situation like this unprecedented pandemic we are living now. And Europe has the capacity to do it because we've always been producers, manufacturers, and we've always had a European approach to how we deal with pharmaceuticals. The authorization of pharmaceuticals is taking place at the European level, at the central level. We don't have only national authorizations. So I think it is very important that we also invest in this new pharmaceutical strategy and the way it has prioritized quality, safety, and security of supply in Europe. Now, data has been mentioned. I think that the priority of digital is an area where we have to invest also a lot. It is a unique opportunity because beyond the pandemic, the big challenges of our generations and our European societies that have very good quality of life are linked to the fact that we live longer, but with that come a number of problems. You have a proliferation of non-communicable diseases such as cancer. You have a proliferation of neurodegenerative diseases that are also linked to the higher life expectancy. And for those, you need personalized treatment. You cannot have generalized medicine. And for that, you need data. And you need big data so that you can process, have statistics, etc. But you also need personalized data. More than ever, we saw the relevance of having secure and privacy-friendly spaces for this data. because so far we have left it to ad hoc initiatives of the industry. I think we need a more industrial approach and a more European values approach, because we know that patients are very much willing to share their data. We have Eurobarometers that show us that is the case, but subject to their own consent, respecting data protection and ensuring the security of their information. So this is where we're going to go with the creation of this European health data space that we have already announced. And I think that's exactly an area where we need more investment, we need more accumulation of data, and we need also very good collaboration so that we do not duplicate, but that we actually make sure that we cover the gaps where this is necessary. Last but not least, unfortunately, the EU for Health program has suffered in the negotiations in terms of amounts that were dedicated to it. But what has changed in Europe is that health is now present in all priorities. So if you look at, for instance, the Digital Euro program, which is quite an important financial program for the coming years in the European budget, there you have a lot of elements that link technology, security, artificial intelligence, new technologies, and health, the security of health data, the safety of health data. So this is very important. And then we have, of course, our research programs. And I think there, the use of health data will become more and more central in Europe. So I think that this way I gave you the global idea of how we see things.
Yes, thank you. You did give us some perspective of how the approach, these concepts of strategic autonomy fit in the broader picture of seeing how industry, and within that the life sciences industry, needs to respond in terms of digital, the skills, and making sure the investment supports the development and transformation that we're all looking for. Let me now turn to someone from industry who's going to share a perspective. I'm going to introduce George Katsourakis, who is the Senior Vice President and Head of Europe at GlaxoSmithKline. So, I mean, we live in a very changing world, and this year, more than any other, I think, has been turbulent, and we've seen change. And Europe is competing with other parts of the globe. From the point of view of the pharma industry, what do you hope the EU's industrial policy could do to support our competitiveness?
Good morning, Tamsin. I hope you can hear me well.
Yes.
I'm delighted to be joining the Friends of Europe this morning, and also just listening to my fellow panelists. It's very exciting to hear the focus of health. It's exciting, not surprisingly, but still, good to hear it as someone that works in the healthcare space, in the healthcare industry. To your question, we know that exactly 9 months ago, the Commission published its industrial strategy for Europe, and interestingly, in terms of timing, just a day later, 24 hours later, the WHO declared COVID-19 as a global pandemic. And as many of my fellow panelists said, for the past 9 months, all of us, we've experienced a shock to the system, which has caused lots of lives. It has put a lot of pressure and compromised our healthcare systems, and has driven massive economic uncertainty and instability. At first, what we all saw, and it was kind of mentioned, we saw a country-by-country response and the use of trade restrictions as countries were, firefighting to secure essential medical products, which honestly, created lots of issues to the European and global coordination, and also to our supply chains at a time when these essential medicines and essential supplies were needed the most. But then very quickly, I think we saw a shift, particularly in Europe, and we saw the European Union stepping up, leading the way on COVID. And we've seen extraordinary coordination between the EU countries, but also we've seen strong collaboration and cooperation between the EU with our umbrella trade association, with FPA, but also with individual industry representatives. I think to me, the main lesson is that the pandemic has been a huge reminder, a huge wake-up call, as they say, that health is not a cost, but it's an investment. And I know, we tend to say that a lot, but to be honest, that's not the way it was, things were coming across during the previous financial crisis when we were going through fiscal consolidation and austerity. So now, as a member of the industry, feeling strongly that the industry can be part of the solution rather than part of the problem is something very positive. I think one of the many lessons that COVID-19 has taught to all of us is that the solution to the current pandemic will come from medical innovation, and that the healthcare sector, not just pharmaceuticals, but more broadly, is strategically important to Europe's future and economic prosperity. I mean, already in your intro, you mentioned a couple of examples. The vaccines, which are so essential now, using different types of technology, whether they are mRNA vaccines or adjuvanted vaccines, new treatments like such as monoclonal antibodies and antivirals, which are also important as vaccines will take time to have a significant impact on the pandemic, but also even after vaccinations, we should expect, like with other diseases, an endemic phase of the disease. The strategy, the industrial strategy, which was published in March, recognizes the importance of the pharmaceutical sector and of innovations. And the same we saw in the European Parliament's report, which was published a couple of weeks ago. I think that's great, and we definitely welcome it from an industry perspective. My personal hope is that this renewed industrial strategy that Despina spoke about and will be published next year in March will and can provide game-changing solutions to boost Europe's leadership in pharmaceutical innovation. The good news is that, and again it was mentioned, that we are not starting from scratch. We are already, as Europe, a leading producer and exporter of innovation. Just to mention a few numbers, in terms of R&D footprint and our research-based pharmaceutical industry, we are a global exporter in Europe. In 2019 alone, the research-based industry invested around 38 billion euros in R&D in Europe. We directly employed as an industry almost 800,000 people, and we've contributed around 5 billion to the balance of trade. If I speak about my own shop in GSK, we directly employ over 25,000 colleagues through a network that spans across 14 manufacturing and 4 R&D sites across Europe. So vaccines, which is at the center of the talk right now, we produce in Europe a huge proportion of our vaccines, and we are the leading vaccine producer in the world. Our global headquarters for vaccines are in Belgium, just a few kilometers, I guess, from where you are sitting. And we make most vaccines and available worldwide, but distributed from Europe. Yeah. Just in 2019, at GSK, we invested more than 2 billion euros across Europe to develop our pipeline across pharmaceuticals, vaccines, and our consumer healthcare portfolio. So, we're in a strong position, but that said, competition to attract investment in innovative sectors have never been more intense. So, with other world economies now moving fast and faster, in order for Europe to reverse the trend, we believe that we need a world-class innovation ecosystem.
Great. Thank you very much. And I'm going to be inviting in the audience to share some of their views, and we'll be picking up on some of these elements and perhaps exploring what George just mentioned there, what is an innovation ecosystem, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But let me invite in our first message from the audience. I'd like to invite Carlo Martuschelli from Politico. Would you like to unmute yourself and share your question? Hello.
Yes, hi. Thank you so much for taking my question. Carlo Martuschelli from Politico here. My question is for Romain, who mentioned how important it is to achieve autonomy in health. Now, Europe has a strong reliance on APIs from Asia, but it's maybe reliance on one country in particular, which might cause worry. The Commission has called China a systemic rival. So I wanted to know, how have relations with China affected your government's position on this? Thank you.
Okay. So, Romain, this is a specific issue here, looking at our partners around the world. And we talked about, global competitiveness, but as well, in this last year, we've collaborated to move forward. So, Romain, would you like to answer that? If we see China as our strategic rival or a partner?
Thank you very much for the question, Carlo. I think this is not the way we are building our industrial policy in the field of resilience. As I said, we have basically a strategic analysis on the sectors where we believe we need to achieve this strategic autonomy. So I quoted 5 sectors where we have a specific action. So right now, one of them is health. And then among these sectors, we are looking at the products and services which are essential. It's true that for a number of them in the field of health, we will find China as a relevant competitor, partner, supplier. I would say that the concrete actions we are putting in place to implement this strategic autonomy policy is not directed against China. It's something we do in all the products and services we consider for these policies. And of course, the fact is, in this particular market, we will find a lot of things which will have an impact on China. So I would say our policy is not directed towards or against one or the other partners. It's not how we see it. It's basically we look at the products and services we actually need, where we want to achieve strategic autonomy. And then for this particular services and products, we put in place a specific strategic oriented policy to achieve this strategic autonomy in terms of R&D, in terms of industrial capacity.
Excellent, thank you. And I know that MEP Christophe Grudler would also like to come in on this issue. Christophe, could you unmute yourself? You're on mute, Christophe.
It's better
Excellent.
like that?
Yes,
okay.
much better. Thank
Okay.
you.
Just about your question about China, rival or partner. I think it's very important to explain what is strategic autonomy. It is not protectionism. We can have China like a partner, but how can I say? We have the strategic autonomy is to have our destiny in our own hands. That means we can make business with China, but not only with China. We need maybe 4 or 5 other countries. It's autonomic, strategic autonomy, because we are not depending only on one. And we have to continue international cooperation about health, with maybe Horizon Europe, maybe ERC. It's very open to the world, but having our destiny in our own hands. And maybe some seconds to, okay, of course, for some part, we will relocate a part of production, of industrial production, but we are not, we don't want to relocate all the production because it will cost more money, of course. And another contradiction is that if we relocate all the production in Europe, we will maybe pollute a little more, and it's not exactly the Green Deal. Of course, when you relocate the production of pharmaceutical products, of course, you have more CO2. It's chemical production, but we are moving to a new strategy for chemical production, which will be more sustainable, and I think it will be the future. But it's not relocating all and to have protectionism in Europe. That's the message I want to give. It's more open.
Okay, thank you for that, Christophe. And I'm going to invite Despina to come back on this issue, because George talked about the need for an innovation ecosystem. And here we've got this broader question of strategic autonomy and the circular economy and other areas. How do you find that sweet spot in the middle where we're able to touch all aspects of the innovation ecosphere, including what you mentioned, skills and jobs and training, as well as research, but also picking up on our other political priorities, such as the Green Deal, the circular economy, and do all of that in a way that contributes towards strategic autonomy? It's quite a hard balancing act. Despina.
Yes, it is a hard balancing act, but it is the way we are working across the board in this Commission. The flagship initiatives of the Green Deal and the digital transformation of Europe are two factors that are always considered across all our policies. Even in our security work, to give you an example, we consider the impact on the environment. So I think that one should not exclude the other. I think that it is about marrying all these elements, and this is the fantastic benefit of having the Green Deal and unrolling it at the same time as unrolling a strong health union and the digital transformation of Europe. I think that it is about considering health in all policies as much as we consider green in all policies, etc. I do not think that we will consider, of course, strategic investments necessarily only on the basis of how green they are. I think you need to also counterbalance with other areas. So, you green one more area because it is about the overall impact, etc. And speaking about our trading partners, you know that Europe has always been open to work with third countries. We never excluded anyone. And it is all about respecting the norms of the internal market. And I would put any third country in this respect. And you saw that, for instance, with the United States last week, when we sent the agenda of our EU-US relations in view of the upcoming new administration in the United States, we put health at the forefront. We put health at the forefront, saying that this is an area where we need to collaborate more, because we saw with COVID that you cannot work alone. So I think the idea is not to have an either-or approach, to consider everything and then to look at the overall balance. And this is the benefit of having a harmonization system in the EU.
Excellent, thank you. George, let me bring you back on this issue where we're looking at issues of how we support all the aspects of an innovation ecosystem with these other big political agendas. George, go ahead.
Yeah, just to mention a couple of things on this topic of innovation ecosystem. I mean, we've got the policy initiatives. I don't think we need any more of that. The question to me, and what we should all reflect on, is, how do we implement them and prioritize elements within those initiatives in a coherent way when we're thinking about the pharma strategy, IP, intellectual property, trade initiatives, and how do we implement them in a way which are truly supportive of medical innovation? The way, at least I see it, is that the industrial strategy is the overarching umbrella under which pharma strategy, IP, trade, and other initiatives are falling. And we need to make sure that this renewed ambition for innovation is a red thread of all these strategies. Intellectual property, it's essential. Having a strong, predictable framework for innovative medicines. If that doesn't exist, innovation and innovative medicines and vaccines will not exist. If this is if this is dismantled or challenged, it's going to be an issue. So we should try to improve it rather than to hurt it. Also, on this topic of strategic autonomy, we need to be a bit thoughtful because, innovation and expertise never exist in one place. So what we should be thinking is, how do we have, resilient research and development of new medicines and vaccines? How do we have resilient supply chains? Also, we need to be thinking a bit or looking a bit deeper. When we're talking about a big part of the APIs coming from China or elsewhere, it could be the case, and some of it, we need to think how to reshore it in a smart way. That, like Despina said, but is it the type of APIs, for example, that we care most about, or should we be looking, where are the innovative vaccines produced? Where are the APIs or it's not even APIs, the components of innovative monoclonal antibodies like the ones, for solution to COVID, where those are discovered and produced. Because I think if we do that, we will find a lot of that is actually happening within Europe. So, my message is, focus on innovation, provide the framework in terms of IP, regulatory, coherent policy initiatives. And think about resilient supply chains and R&D infrastructure rather than reshoring everything.
Thank you. I'm going to bring in somebody else from the audience, and I'm actually going to invite Nina Rawal to come in. She's a European young leader who we've worked with here at Friends of Europe. Nina, what would you like to ask, or what comment would you like to make?
Thank you, Tamsin. Good afternoon, good day, everyone. So I'm working in venture capital, thinking about the innovation side of things. And my question, when we speak of an industrial agenda, would of course be to think about capitalization and financing of innovation in Europe. So from my perspective, Europe does a great job at investing in early research, as someone mentioned before. There's a lot of money to be found for early stage companies in this area. But then as they develop into product developing companies, and this is of course a very capital intense sector, there really isn't a lot of capital to be found. I see someone from EIB in the audience, and I know that there are lots of initiatives going on, let's say on kind of the EU side. But my question would really be, how do we make sure that we also build a bigger and stronger network of investors across Europe? Because when we compare to other geographies that are also investing in innovation and life science, there's more capital, there are more teams, younger teams that are addressing this challenge. So my question is, what do we do with that? Because if we don't address the capital side of things, these companies, these products, innovations will never get to patients, they will never get to the market. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very useful question for us to explore, because as you say, Europe's not short of ideas. And we see, the pipeline is certainly being fed by the investment in early R&D, but it's, moving things along the value chain that we have an issue. Despina, let me invite you to come back on this, because, if we look at where the gaps are, Nina, who works in the area of venture capital, says we just don't have the sets of people that with the finance behind them ready to step in and help this development. Where is this an area that Europe could help with? And Romain, I'll be coming to you in a minute. Despina, you're on mute. You need to unmute.
Yes, thank you. I think you can hear me now. I think that, again, one of the benefits of Europe is to pull people together and to find the expertise, because I think this is where the question is targeted. Where do you find the expertise that you need, the right people to tell you where you need to go for the innovation? I think we need to pull a lot more resources. We have to use our programs to go beyond the traditional approach of research. We have to change the way we do things. You know that we invest a lot in Europe in research and innovation. It has always been the case. It is a very large part of our budget. But the way we have been doing it has been the same for years. And we have in many areas of our research the very typical phenomenon of the valley of the death, meaning a lot of projects, are tabled and then they never live alive. This is why you need more concrete initiatives. The IMI was a good showcase for that. You need more concrete initiatives that bring actors together. And this is where you identify the areas where you need to innovate more, invest more, etc.
Romain, let me turn to you, because again, you've talked about the big Grand Relance plan. Here we've identified, Nina said, look, the ideas are there, we've got the qualified researchers, etc. What we need is the people who've got the money to transform that into viable industries and to turn the startup into a medium-sized company or something that's got the scale to engage. Are you dealing with this in your big plans?
Yes, actually, we were dealing with this even before the crisis, because I think I fully share the statement which was made by Nina. I mean, it is what we notice in France. We have no problem finding money at early stage for innovative companies, but when we go late stage, it's much more difficult, especially for scaling up. So for that in France, we have put in place what we are calling TB funds, which are basically institutional investors addressing the segment of, I would say, several hundred millions of investment for companies which are scaling up. We believe that in health tech, there are especially specific difficulties to value the investment, because it's technical, it's you need some expertise, and so I think we need dedicated funds for health. And regarding scaling up, we believe an initiative at European level could be warranted. For example, involving the European Investment Fund to specifically address the scale up of innovative companies in health. So I think that would be something we miss right now. And the other thing, as I said in my introductory statement, is that I believe we need to rethink our public support for industrial capacity, which is, I think, where we are kind of weak in general, and we are trying to address it through our recovery plan in France. So basically to make project reality by having some public support when we are talking about putting in place factories. I think there is some specific companies, the startups which are industrial startups. It's I think an area where we have some value which is currently a bit locked, because it's very difficult for in this type of situation, innovative companies, small size, but needing big investment in factories. And for that, I think some higher level of public support would be more efficient, so that we can cover the whole chain of investment.
Excellent. Thank you, Romain. Presumably, if we're looking at public policies and public support and financing for this kind of industrial capacities and facilities, that's where we make the cross-link to other areas like the circular economy, where we would seek to create industrial clusters of different companies that could support each other and share materials, etc. So I think this is an area where there would be a good coherence between different industrial processes. I'm going to bring in somebody else from the audience. I'm going to invite Elizabeth Kuiper to share her viewpoint and her questions. Elizabeth, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thank you so much, Tamsin. Do you hear me well?
Yes, we do.
Well, thank you so much, because I think it's a really timely debate to discuss, indeed, autonomy versus innovation. Because the current crisis really has shown that innovation is the way out of the crisis, with new vaccines, new treatments. And speaking from the perspective of the innovative industry, and I think that was mentioned in the chat already as well, for us, bringing back active ingredients to Europe is not so much part of the solution, because already 76% approximately of our ingredients come from Europe and are exported from Europe. However, it's really to do with the right incentives, the right IP framework, in order to make sure that Europe stays at that forefront of innovation. So my question would be to Despina, because I know that the recent IP action plan that the Commission has presented stresses indeed the need for IP, for incentives, in order to make sure that we will have also in the future innovation and an R&D ecosystem in Europe. So when it comes to the update of the industrial strategy that I think is expected in early 2021, how will you make the connection between the Commission's IP action plan and the policy actions that likely you might want to propose in the updated industrial action plan? Thank you so much.
Okay, that's an interesting point, because as you said, Elizabeth, this issue of IP sits in the broader segments of the innovation ecosystem. And if we're going to be generating new ideas that turn into new products and services that are then used in our systems, we need to make sure we've got the right incentives there. So Despina, the IP action plan, how does that relate to the kinds of things that you want to do through the industrial strategy? Because we heard earlier that sometimes it's things like basic masks and personal protective equipment. There's not a lot of IP there, but it was that we were also missing. as well as the cutting-edge frontier, new, innovative products that we were looking at. And your industrial policy, obviously covers that whole range from the very basic that we also need and the new emerging things. How do you see IP fitting into that broader perspective?
Yeah, I think you're right that the IP is not so much about protective equipment, but it is very important for innovative medicine and medicine that goes into also the personalized care we were talking about, etc. So I think that Europe there has always been at the forefront because our regulatory framework was always very modern and very much focused on innovation, on ensuring that we keep growing and developing. So definitely it has a relevance. At the same time, it is not only about protecting what we produce, it is also about having very sufficient and the necessary components of supply chain. And we won't be able to do everything in Europe. So it is beyond protecting what we do here. It is also about ensuring how we deal with these issues in trade policy, even IP. We have to start injecting also our trade policies a lot more with that. We have to make sure that we have a very clear idea of where our strengths are and where we need to invest more in imports. We know very well that in some areas this is unavoidable because we won't be able to produce everything in Europe. And our industrial strategy made very specific reference to that, the needs about health and the manufacturing sector of medical devices, personal protective equipment, all that is covered. So I think it is part of the equation for sure. I'm not able to give you much more detail, but definitely not alone.
Thank you. We're coming towards the end of our time together, and we've got the last few minutes of this debate. And I know that George wanted to come in on this issue as well. But what I'm going to ask each panelist to just give us one big idea where they think Europe can make the difference. And remember, I started my introduction by saying that the last 12 months has seen a big shift in how Europe sees itself. If it saw itself as a brains and services powerhouse, we're now changing that. And we're now seeing that we need to also revive our history as an industrial powerhouse, but transformed for the 21st century. So let me ask each of our speakers for just very briefly, because we've got 3 minutes left on this session, one big idea that you think Europe can contribute to this new vision of the industrial heart of Europe. So George, shall I start with you, because I know you'd wanted to come in. George, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So first of all, just one sentence on the previous couple of questions around, financing of innovation and also what Elizabeth mentioned. I think an aspect that we didn't speak about and is part of the solution is, how innovation gets recognized and rewarded across Europe, and also, how do we ensure that the regulatory framework, the HTA assessment framework, also ensures speed to market and fast access of that innovation for patients. Because if it's innovation that is not used, then it's useless innovation. In terms of your question on the big idea, to me, a big idea doesn't need to be super smart. It has to be something that has impact. And to me, it would be great, and I think it's part of the plan for the Commission, and the European Union to define what success looks like and define relevant KPIs. Because if that's done, then you measure against you measure yourself against those KPIs, and you're making sure that you are making progress in the right direction, and you're ensuring also that all these policy initiatives are coherent, like I said, rather than each of them taking a life of its own. So,
so coherence.
The idea is defining success and having relevant key performance indicators.
Thank you. Christoph, let me come to you. One big idea about how Europe redefines its industrial role.
Well, maybe we must better support the digitalization of the European health industry. As you know, data on machine learning are becoming extremely important in the development of new technologies on medicines. If we want Europe champions in health, we need more digitalization from the small SME to the big company. Maybe an idea could be to have an European alliance in the digital for the health sector, such as we have alliance for hydrogen or batteries, for example. And Europe has a huge potential. So let's develop it and make sure we help our industry to win the race to innovation in strategic sectors. Thank you.
Thank you. Romain, one big idea.
Yes, actually, it will be quite a simple idea, because I think the debate shows that there is some very good level of alignment on this idea of strategic autonomy, which is, I think, completely justified by what we have seen through the crisis. So I think the big idea now is speed of implementation at European level. We need to turn this concept into concrete acts. That's what we are trying to do with our recovery plan in France. But as we discussed, I believe there are many things to implement at European level to actually give the scale to this action on strategic autonomy and boosting what we can do at national level.
Excellent, thank you. And with that, I'm going to bring our conversation to a conclusion. I think we had a very useful and interesting debate. We covered a very broad range of issues, including the concept of how Europe sees itself compared to the rest of the world, how we collaborate but compete in an era where knowledge is global and services and products go all the way around the world. And we talked a little bit about the importance of digital and skills. We talked about the importance of looking not just at the early ideas, but taking them right through the commercialization stage and getting them through regulation and to market. We've talked about how Europe has incredible assets to build on. It is already very strong in life sciences, but as we move forward and we relaunch our economies post-COVID, this is an area the strategic autonomy and resilience of our health and life sciences sector is going to need more attention. So I'd like to say a warm thank you to everyone who participated and those our speakers who gave us their insights. Please feel free to look at the Friends of Europe website, because we have more events coming up, including next week, where we're going to be looking at energy and climate. However you celebrate the end of the year, have a good break. I hope you're in good health, and may 2021 bring us positive changes. Thank you from Brussels, and goodbye.